Good afternoon, everyone. We are Group 5. I am Nerlex L. Malaran. Let's start, and I hope you will listen. What we will discuss this afternoon is about the peasants. What exactly are peasants? A peasant, a person who owns or rents a small piece of land and grows crops, keep animals, etc. on it, especially one who has a low income, very little education, and a low social position. This is usually used of someone who live in the past or of someone in a poor country. A peasant is a poor person of low social status who works on the land. Use of people who live in countries where farming is still a common life. In the Middle Ages, the majority of the population lived in the countryside, and some 85% of the population could be described as peasants. Peasants worked the land to yield food, fuel, wool, and other resources. The countryside was divided into estates run by a lord or an institution, such as monastery or college. A social hierarchy divided the peasantry at the bottom of the structure were the serfs who were legally tied to the land they work. They were obliged both to grow their own food and to labor for the landowner. At the upper end were the freemen, who were often enterprising smallholders, renting land from the lord or even owning land in their own right and able to make considerable amounts of money. Other workers carried out trades such as basket weaving or beekeeping, a complex web of ties formalized by a sworn oath defined the relationships between kings, lords, vassals, serfs, and so on. Uulitin natin guys, no? Ang peasants ay magsasaka or farmer. Sila yung uri ng mga tao na nagbubukid ng lupa bilang maliit na may-ari ng lupa o manggagawang pang-agrikultura. Sila yung tinutukoy na maliit na agrikultural sa Europa na makasaysayang panahon, but many other societies, both past and present, have had a peasant class. Peasant, usually an educated person of low social status. Halos 5% lang ng population could read or write. Churches were the main source of knowledge and schooling sa mga peasants, no? Kaya rin limited education lang dahil konti lang ang schools in the Middle Ages. Kahit Lord of the Manor was often unable to read or write. Peasants did not eat much meat also. Peasant Peasants ate meat whenever they could get it, unless it was a religious fast day, kagaya ng every Friday, the 40 days leading up to Easter and Advent, and the 4 weeks before Christmas. So that's all. Next reporter, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Crislin Arapacalino, and I am the reporter of the said issues of peasants. First is due to the removal of state controls on agriculture related commodities, the prices of agricultural inputs. Second is population growth and land degradation. And the third is falling from roughly 3% in the 1960s. Fourth is imported rice is currently floating in the market. And last but not least is assassinated due to the land ownership. Actually, yes, the main issue for social movements in the Philippines is how to deal with the state and its laws. I think they have not yet realized that those are not contested terrain. Now captive to traditional power holders, state leaders are not immune to corporate pressure. And there are also internal weaknesses. They enforce laws that have loopholes or gaps, and most officials are corrupt. This means that laws are not automatically enforced by the Philippine state. Rural movements must therefore seek to enforce them, and but to do so, they must be organized with the capacity to challenge the power of the state and business. And also, they need to strengthen their organization, develop critical legal awareness, and learn about the space with which they are interact. In areas where indigenous or landless peasants communities are not organized, for example, agrarian reform, or the law that protecting indigenous rights has never really been implemented, and despite official reports to the contrary, mobilization is therefore key. And there are also elements in the law that can be used to best effect, but there are also gaps that need to be protected against. This is all the more the case as the current government is moving toward even greater liberalization and commodification of land. The Philippine state is in the midst of a transition to even more like liberalized form for governance. For their part, land ownership and corporations have always resisted land reform because they want to keep their land intact or exploit it for profit. And they are therefore the main actors shaping the dynamics of land reform today. In this context, for me, the most important thing is that indigenous people and small farmers organize themselves or to be able to influence these dynamics to ensure that what comes out of it is good for them. That's all, and thank you.
Good afternoon, sister. I am Kishamay M. Bilog. I am the reporter of Peasants After 1857 and Peasant Status. Peasants after 1857 farm to market roads and equipment needed to prevent losses from exposure, pests, and natural deterioration. The peasants suffered from high rents, illegal levies, and arbitrary eviction and unpaid labor in zamindari areas. The demands were centered almost wholly on economic issues. The struggle were directed towards specific and limited objectives and redressal of particular grievances. So, peasants in zamindari areas has faced high rents, such as the government collected massive revenue from the land, burdened farmers who feared losing their only source of livelihood often turned to a local moneylender, taking full advantage of the hardship of the fast, so charging high interest on the money lent to them. Therefore, the real peasants become volunteer, proportional, and landless workers, and peasants often resisted exploitation. Peasant status: 7 out of the 10 farmers in the Philippines do not own the land they farm. Low social status who works on the land. Kilusan Mangbubid ng Pilipinas, or also known KMP, the Peasants Movement of the Philippines, is the democratic mass or organization of the Filipino peasants that fight for the social justice and the genuine agrarian reform as distinct from the half measures which politicians have so far advanced. So therefore, a peasant is a poor person of the low social status who works on the land use of people who live in the countries. Peasant is a pre-industrial agriculture laborer or a farmer with limited land ownership, especially one living in the Middle Age under feudalism.
So, good morning, Mom. I'm Jamaica Limbuan from Group 5. So, my topic for today is all about peasant in international sector, which has a four sector, which is the China, Africa, Latin America, and the Brazil. So, the peasant in international sector in China. Who are the peasants in China? For centuries, China's farmers practiced agriculture in a way that sustained a high level of food production without depleting or deteriorating local resources. These were smallholder farmers who came to be called peasant or Nongmin in the early 20th century. What did the peasants do in China? The majority of the people in ancient China were peasants farmers, although they were respected for the food they provided for the rest of the Chinese. They lived though and difficult lives. The typical farmer lived in small villages of around 100 families. They worked small family farms. What was life like for peasants in China? The vast majority of peasants live and work on small pieces of land. The typical peasant family consisted of a husband, wife, and 2 or 3 children. Their land was approximately 10 acres and might also contain a garden, farmyard, and mulberry trees. Most peasants live in 1 or 2 story houses. So, peasant in the international sector of India. What was peasant life like in India? India's daily life for peasant consisted for working the land. Life was harsh, with a limited diet and little comfort. Women were subordinate to men in both the peasant and noble classes, and were expected to ensure the smooth running of the household. So, what was job did peasants have in China? Most medieval peasants worked in the fields. They did farm-related jobs such as plowing, sowing, reaping, or threshing. Some peasants worked in the land's manure. They would have done household tasks such as cleaning, cooking, and laundry. The importance of peasant farming. Peasant agriculture, the panel argued, contributes positively to food security, overall economic development, employment and income, productivity, sustainability, landscape, biodiversity, climate, emancipation, and cultural heritage. These are the importance of peasant farming in the India. So, peasant in the international sector of Latin America. At the end of the 70s, many experts argue that peasant movements were an anachronistic declining force for social transformation. Peasant organizations have more than made up for quantitative losses in relative population with qualitative gains in organization, leadership, strategies, and tactics. Most of the peasant movements directly engage in one or another form or of political action. They have played a leading role in the fight against the Free Trade Area of Americas or ALCA in Brazil, Central America, especially in Guatemala, Ecuador, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. Peasant movements have led the fight against genetically modified and chemically based agriculture promoted by Monsanto in favor of ecologically sound cultivation. Peasant movements have led the struggle against the fumigation of food crops and defense of coca farming, an important source of family income with multiplier effect throughout the economy. So this is the peasant international sector in Latin India. So in Brazil, the date was established by the organization that are a part of the La Via Campesina, which organized activities in more than 70 countries. It also part of the Brazil official calendar as day to commemorate the memory of 19 landless workers who were brutally killed by the military police officers in El Dorado dos Carajas in the northern state of Para in April 1996. With the slogan Peasants. Right now, with the land reform and social justice, the organization will stage demonstrations and activities to push advances in public policies of rural areas. Brazil is also the Latin American country whose agricultural land is the most unevenly distributed and where there are still very many farmers with small land holdings or minifundia and farmers with no land at all. Despite effort by Lula administration to promote homesteading despite the awarding of direct grants to the poorest family and relatively rapid rate of industrialization. It is clear that extreme poverty and malnutrition have not really disappeared from the country. Traditionally considered one of the poorest regions in the Brazil, the Northeast or Nordeste seems to be one of the concentrated in the hands of powerful families of coronis or colonels who managed to be successful come rain or shine. Peasant agriculture has only had been able to subsist in the areas abandoned by large farms or ecological, economic, or social reasons. So this is the peasant in the international sector of China, Africa, Latin America, and the Brazil. Thank you.
So good day everyone, I am Dan Manulat from Group 5 Peasants, the needs. Rights of peasants, the fair distribution of income, access for the poor to land and natural resources, and new management models that place human needs before profits. Rights of resources, particularly the rights to land, water, and food are critical for human dignity and survival. Land and natural resources rights are political rights of people and communities to decide how to use, manage, protect, and share land and the natural wealth and the territories and they inhabit. Thank you.
Para mas madagdagan ang inyong kaalaman tungkol sa peasants, panoorin niyo ang bidyong ito.
Life in a medieval village, Western Europe. During the Middle Ages, the majority of people lived in rural villages rather than urban cities or large towns. But what was everyday life like in a medieval village? The truth is, like many periods in history, medieval life differed from village to village and from person to person. Life in a medieval village depended on someone's class and role in society. Generally speaking, though, the medieval village was the domain of the peasant. Peasants were the lowest class of society, but they actually made up the majority of the entire population. For this majority, the village was the center of their universe. They were born, lived, worked, attended church, were married, had children, and died all within the same area. Today, we might imagine a medieval village as a line, square, or several little rows of houses, with a tavern and a church. But the medieval village actually took on many forms. It could be several houses clustered together, but a village could also be several scattered hamlets and farmsteads, far apart but under the control of a lord. Most villages would have been houses concentrated around a lord's manor, that is, an administrative device by which a lord charged rents and taxes from peasants. By far the most common villager was the serf. Serfs were the lowest class of peasants and owed fealty to the lord of the manor. Though they were legally free, therefore being different from slaves, they were nevertheless legally bound to the land where they lived and worked, and they were not allowed to move away. The lord of the manor would barely, if ever, be in the village. Instead, he would be away fighting in wars or performing acts of royal service. Manors would be surrounded by huge fields, usually 3 of up to 100 acres each, which would make up the land for the village. In exchange for living on the land, serfs were expected to pay rent and be responsible for working the land. In northwestern Europe, much of the work revolved around farming cereal crops such as wheat, barley, or rye. Fields surrounding the manor would be worked in rotation, and each would be divided into strips to be worked by individual peasant families. Village fields that weren't fit for growing crops would be used for grazing animals, such as sheep for wool. Beyond the fields would often be woodland, which gave fuel and building materials or where wild animals could be hunted for food, but only for a privileged few. Resources cultivated in the countryside villages would feed and provide for the village residents, but would also be transported to those living in nearby towns and cities. For the village serf, daily life was difficult, backbreaking, and a constant struggle for survival. From starvation to the plague, it seemed as though the threat of death was always on the horizon. The average village house might have had a low stone wall and a thatched roof, and would have been built mostly out of timber and wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden strips clung together with a mix of wet soil, clay, or animal dung. The majority of medieval villagers would wake at sunrise in order to make the most of the working day. They would work extremely hard from dawn to dusk, with meager meals of bread and pottage, a thick soup made from porridge, peas, and beans. Most villages kept communal cows, so milk, butter, and cheese would also make the menu, with meat being an extremely rare treat until the 15th century. Ale was part of the payment that the peasants received for working the lands of the manor. The peasants received portions of everything produced on the land, although more expensive items were given in smaller quantities. Villagers were highly religious due to widespread Catholicism at the time. They would go to church daily, if not multiple times a day. However, unlike the nobility or richer folk living in cities and towns, village peasants weren't expected to do more than the bare minimum when it came to their daily prayers. It was thought that if you performed your duties by working hard, plowing the fields, and providing for the realm, then you would be rewarded in the afterlife. Daily life in a medieval village would also change depending on the time of year. The necessary work for villagers depended on the month, whether that be harvesting wheat in July or slaughtering farm animals for food in November. Medieval time was also heavily governed by the church, with every month bringing New Saints' Day and the hours of the day being tracked by the church bell. While village life was extremely hard work, the sheer amount of religious feast days meant that there was always cause for rest and celebration. However, not all those living in the village would spend their days as serfs working the land. Some would be a higher class of peasant. In the lord's absence, the village manor would be run by a steward, the highest-ranking village official. Each village would also have a bailiff, a man appointed to supervise over the agricultural work done by serfs. Understandably, they were not very popular amongst the villagers. There would also be trade workers such as bakers, millers, and blacksmiths. Each village would also have its own priest. To be the village priest was to be in a position of power and respect, as they were considered to be absolutely necessary for the salvation of everyone's souls. The medieval village was remarkably self-sufficient, with an immense sense of community. Villagers would produce everything they needed themselves, in contrast to those in urban areas, which in the 12th century were starting to grow and relied on resources sent from villages. Villagers would make their own clothes from leather, linen, or wool. They would grow their own food using farm tools made by the village blacksmith. They could grind grain for flour at the village mill, and there would be communal bakers where villagers could bring their loaves to be baked. Villagers were also practically self-governing. In medieval England, a law system called frank pledge was put in place, which meant that all villagers were equally responsible for the behavior of their peers and neighbors. Between 1346 and 1353, the bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, claimed 30 to 60% of Europe's population. In the wake of the plague, so many peasants had died that there were fewer villagers to work on the land. Peasants therefore realized they were a valuable commodity, playing an important role in providing for the realm. They were able to demand higher wages, better working conditions, and lower taxes. These demands led to revolts and uprisings, and eventually led to many peasants rising into higher roles within society. The lower population also meant that fewer crops were needed, driving the price of grain down. Villages that had initially thrived through the growing of grain in large open fields fell into disrepair, and over time, many were deserted until the 16th century. All in all, after the devastation of the plague and the changes in social structure that followed, medieval village life was never quite the same.